So my name's Antonio Buehler. I am an activist of different causes. My primary causes are police-state associated stuff, education, and lately I've been doing more work with more radical leftists and some anti-fascist type stuff. So I'm not really comfortable identifying with anything right now. I think that if one were to try to peg me as something, they would call me an anarchist, but I think they'd have a hard time saying what type of anarchist I am, and quite frankly I would have a hard time doing the same because I don't feel like I necessarily fit into any bucket. The way I got there, I started out very conservative. My family's all military, all conservative. I remember the first political candidate I ever supported was Pat Buchanan, because people in my family supported Pat Buchanan, and that's why. And you know, I went into the military, and that's a very conservative place to be. I supported the Bush wars when I was in the military. I went to Iraq, and it wasn't really until I got to Austin that things started to slowly change. I went down a more libertarian path. I was supporting Ron Paul for president. I ultimately ended up getting arrested in 2012, and that sort of accelerated my development, I guess you would say. And I just kept going what most people would consider a little bit more left, and I eventually got to a place where I just really shed the labels, and I just consider myself of an anarchist stripe of some sort. The Peaceful Streets Project is a grassroots direct action organization that focuses on pushing back against the police state. We're just a bunch of volunteers, no one gets paid. Our primary action is to go out and do cop watching. We also do Know Your Rights trainings. We try to expose police issues in other ways as well. So I don't believe that cop watching in of itself is that it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve any problems, and I have no illusions that it will. The thing about cop watching is it's a very meaningful tactic, and it does a lot for people who can only go out and engage on occasion. And so cop watching is great because it does many different things at once. One is it shows solidarity with the person who's being detained or having some sort of interaction with the police. It's usually a very lonely place. Two is it changes the behavior of police officers. So most police officers will sort of draw back or cool down when they know someone's filming them. Less likely to abuse someone, less likely to commit a crime against someone. Three is it provides potential evidence in a criminal case to support the defendant. We would never share video with the police to go after someone, but we would happily share it with the defendant so that they could defend themselves. Four is it can be used by that person in a civil suit at some case, and so three times people have used our videos thus far in a civil suit type scenario, which is great. Five is that it helps build community. It builds community both amongst the people who are actually in the community where the police are engaging, you know, for them to see people out there. It's you know, just like the person who's dealing with the cop, there's solidarity there. Oftentimes people in the community see that and they recognize that they can play a role in their sort of self-defense against the police state, and it definitely builds community amongst activists. Cop watching is a very intimate and social thing for activists to do. It carries risk, and there's real benefit. It's real tangible when you're out there, and so it builds a community in the activist circles as well. So, what do you think? I think that police brutality is not necessarily worse today than it has been in the past. The police state has always been violent. It's built on violence. The difference between today and yesterday and yesteryear is that there's a lot more ways to disseminate information about it. There's more video cameras out there. There's more audio recorders out there. There's more means for people to share information. And also the police state has creeped beyond traditionally marginalized and oppressed communities. So it used to be, they would go after indigenous people, and they would go after people of color, but and of course the working class poor. But now the police state has grown to such a large institution, and it needs to perpetuate itself that at times it will catch up people that it historically hasn't. There's no question that policing disproportionately affects communities of color. And for anyone to argue against that, it's just hard to take anyone seriously because there's ample evidence, both anecdotal evidence and more data-driven evidence that shows that policing is focused on expending their resources in communities of color. People of color who commit crimes at the same incidence of the larger white majority are more likely detained, more likely harassed, arrested, beaten, shot, prosecuted, and convicted, and more harshly sentenced. And so the entire criminal justice system is most certainly biased against people of color. I don't believe that there's a such thing as a good cop. I do believe that there are people who join law enforcement with good intentions, and they might even go through their entire career without ever abusing someone outside the scope of their duties. But unfortunately, the institution of policing is not a good institution. It is used to control certain segments of society. It's used to push laws that are unethical and immoral, and it requires a certain sort of fraternity or some sort of loyalty to the system for the people that work in the system. And so even a so-called good cop, what people would call a good cop, a so-called good cop is not going to go on a crusade against all the bad cops, because that would be to go on a crusade against the profession. The best examples that we have of so-called good cops are people who blow the whistle on some sort of quota situation, or a cop who tries to intervene to stop another cop from abusing someone. And what we've seen is time and time again, whenever someone does that, that cop gets fired, or that cop gets killed by a fellow police officer. They get blackballed. They're called a rat. They get run out of the profession. They get threatened. And so very few cops even go that route. There are a lot of cops who retire and then try to take a moral high ground and say, when I was a cop, things were different, but that's just a lie. Yeah. So when people ask what's the alternative to policing, I think that's a really complicated question. First and foremost is that we don't necessarily have to have an institution to replace something when we get rid of it, right? So the institution of slavery was, most people recognize it today as clearly immoral, clearly wrong, but we didn't have to replace it with something, right? Eradicating it was sufficient. And so I think that when people ask, well, you don't like the police, you want to abolish the police, what do you replace the police with? I don't think you have to have an answer to that. It's such a violent, abusive system that cannot be leveraged in a fair, just way that it's worth just eradicating it without having to have an answer of what utopia looks like. So communities that want to eradicate policing, I think that it's important that they think about what their community is and how they support one another. So the overwhelming majority of crime is crime that is incubated through sort of social circumstances such as poverty and the destruction of opportunity and trauma that really generates a lot of that. And I think that if you want to be serious about getting rid of police, it's really important to think about, you know, how you create societies that deal with trauma in a positive, constructive way so that people can heal. How do you create a society that has economic, equality or economic justice at its core? Policing is used disproportionately against people with mental illness. So how do you have a system that takes mental illness seriously in a way where you want to make sure that people are part of the community as opposed to criminalizing them out of the community? And so I think all of that's extremely important. The other thing is I think that people have to change their conceptions of what it means to be co-located with someone, even if it's not a community, but just sort of what's your relationship to your fellow human being. And in a lot of ways, the police are seen as a way to segregate people. Like, get those poor people away from me, get the homeless person away from me, get the, man, that really hurts. It's a way to get the poor person away from me, to get the homeless person away from me, the mentally ill away from me, the immigrants away from me. And I think until we get to the point where we can more embrace what people bring to the community, it's going to be hard to eradicate the police. So painful. I think that the notion of creating defense forces of some sort, whether it's a community run or privately run, is complicated. I think that both are superior alternatives to the police, but I think that each one has some concerns that needs to be taken into account. First and foremost is private security is going to serve whoever's paying them, and we've seen it time and time again. If a corporation is paying for private security, that private security will oftentimes be extremely heavy-handed to anyone who's not a customer. And in our society, the homeless and the mentally ill in particular are not seen as customers, they're seen as nuisances, and private security will be used against them. People who are homeless, especially as we move to less and less public spaces, where do they go? And how does private security treat them? I think that private security can also be used really effectively in a bad way against immigrants and people of color. So I have a problem with private security because they're going to serve who pays them most often, not necessarily having some sort of underlying principles that prevents them from abusing people. Community defense, I think, is a lot more interesting and a lot more meaningful. I do think that they're more accountable to the people, but again, the question is what people. And so if I'm living in my really posh, gated community, we might have some sort of community defense. Well, they're more likely to have private security, but just imagine they're more likely to have a community defense force that might see anyone who invades the space as someone to be dealt harshly with. And then who's going to hold them accountable when they deal with outsiders or the extreme minority? So I think that that's a really challenging type of concept. But I do think it's one that's worth going down because it's better than the current status quo, monopolized, very institutionalized, legally protected police force that we have today. As far as the Black Panthers, I think the Black Panthers are great. Far better alternative than anything that the state was providing. I like the history of the Black Panthers. I think that I'm a big fan of Black liberation, quite honestly, and so to the extent that communities want to provide self-defense against clearly aggressive forces such as the police or the state, the government, I think that's a good thing. but just like I said earlier, it does have the potential to be abused, like everything. So Abrome is my effort on the education front to try to unwind some of the problems in our society. So I think at the core, and I haven't addressed this earlier, but at the core, my biggest concern is hierarchy and power. The more hierarchy, the more power, the more people are abused. And I think that when we look at sort of the problem with the police is they are part of a very hierarchical system, and they are the very strong arm that reaffirms and protects certain members of the upper echelon of the hierarchy to the severe detriment of the people at the bottom. So that's a problem, and I want to get rid of that problem. I want to tear down that hierarchy and eliminate that power. With education, it's very much the same thing, and I think that in a lot of ways education fuels a lot of the beliefs and the norms that we have in our culture that really sort of honors authoritarianism and values it, which leads into things such as the police state and our relations with one another. So my effort in the education space is to run Abrome. I do other things. I do a lot of advocacy work. I work with different educational organizations, but my primary effort is a learning space called Abrome. It's non-hierarchical, non-authoritarian, non-coercive. It's a space where learners come together ages 5 through 19, and they engage in self-directed learning. So there's no curriculum, no teachers, no homework, no tests, no grades. The primary focus is on them understanding their unique needs, interests, and goals, and engaging in learning experiences that they find meaningful so that they can have purpose in their life today and to build for a future in which they can continue to engage in meaningful activities that allow them to lead remarkable lives. In the grand scheme of things, if we have enough people who reject the oppressive nature of schooling when they're young, and they get to the point where they have values that they find meaningful, and they are able to engage in activities that give them value in life, we do get to a place where society can take on some of these other challenges such as policing, because they can see beyond the need for a violent force to maintain the status quo, because most likely they're not going to believe the status quo is something that is to be valued, because they're in a system, they're outside of an oppressive system, and it's usually when you're outside of that system that you can start to recognize some of the problems within it. I do believe that Abrome can be used as a tool to help us navigate from the here and now, where everyone believes that authority has the answers, that there is a universal truth, and all we have to do is be told what that universal truth is, and that we have to maintain the sort of systems that we have today because that's as good as it gets, to a space where people are asking more difficult questions. Who am I? What's my purpose here? What is my role in society, and what's my responsibility to other people within my society, whether it be my partner, my family, my friends, or strangers on the street? I do think that Abrome can be critical in navigating that path, but obviously not us by ourselves. One of the benefits of Abrome, one of the reasons that I started Abrome, wasn't because I thought that I was going to be the one that convinced society that oppressive schooling is really harmful to children and really harmful to society alone. But I wanted to put it out there so that people could see that a non-oppressive, non-coercive, self-directed learning experience for young people really can lead them to lead remarkable lives, that they do so in a way in which they're not making trade-offs. They're not sacrificing their academics, they're not sacrificing their mental health, their emotional health, their physical health, and they're able to lead remarkable lives. And in doing that, and in supporting other people who are doing similar type of initiatives, to include families that unschool, hopefully we get to a point where there's a inflection point in society where the expectation isn't that you send your child to school when they become 5. The expectation is people are going to push you to send your child to school, but why the hell would you ever do that unless you had no other choice? And by doing this more and more, getting more people to make that leap, more and more people will recognize that very few people don't have a choice. And then as we grow the number of empathic people in society, people who care about community, those sort of options for even the people who don't think they have a choice start to proliferate. So I see myself, just like in the police accountability realm, I don't see myself or Peaceful Streets Project as the answer. I see us as one effort amongst many that hopefully can slowly change society for the better. And I think that we will get there on education before we get there on police accountability. What makes me passionate about creating a better world? It's a good question. I don't know. I think that part of what drives me in terms of my activist life is that I've always been very anti-authoritarian, which made my time in public school and at West Point and the military extremely challenging. But I've always been anti-authoritarian. I've always hated hierarchy. It used to be just because I hated being told what to do by people who I thought were incompetent. But as I've grown, I've come to realize that kind of everyone's incompetent, right? Even I'm incompetent in things that I think that I'm really good at. And there's always perception differences as well. And so just the notion of someone having power over someone, even if they are more competent, it's still problematic. And so I just don't like it. I don't like abuse. I don't like when people abuse people. And I guess that in a lot of ways there's just a couple of issues that I've latched on to, and I see that as a way for me to make a meaningful change. But I recognize that not everyone cares about police abuse or education the way that I do, but they care about other things, and I just appreciate when people get engaged if they're focused on deconstructing power and hierarchy. I appreciate when they get engaged in whatever the issue is that they find meaningful. My advice to people, that's challenging. I think that people who want to change the world need to have an orientation where they're constantly checking themselves, to sort of check their belief system, check their ideology, check their talking points, because I fell victim to this, and I probably still do, but I constantly check myself. I'm always evaluating myself. But there was a time where I thought that I knew everything and that the talking points that I adopted from other people were the answer. And then I went out hard charging, trying to convince everyone of the same. And life just reveals itself in ways where you recognize, oh, I wasn't right, and maybe I shouldn't have been so dogmatic about that. I think that there's real value to being dogmatic and to being hard charging on things that you care about, but I also think that there's value in constantly assessing your beliefs so that you can adapt and change when new information comes in. So I think that first thing is one has to have the mindset that they don't know everything and that there's lots to learn still from other people and from literature, etc. But then two is, if you have that mindset, just find a way to get engaged. And not everyone has to be a so-called leader or organizer. There's lots of ways to get engaged. And I actually think that there are too many people want to be leaders, and it's problematic because then when it's hard to build a movement if everyone wants to be a leader, like too many chiefs in the kitchen type thing, and then that ends up just fracturing groups because everyone wants their own little fiefdom. So I think that just getting engaged in whatever way that you can, particularly if it's a way that you can learn and understand what's going on, I think that's really important. I think that people should also not overextend themselves. I overextend myself. Ideally, you shouldn't be fighting 3 or 4 battles at once. I think that people are a lot more effective when they pick 1 or 2 things that are really meaningful and really dive into that. It doesn't mean that you don't care about the other issues. You can certainly support people who do, but burnout amongst people who try to influence society in a positive way through activism is just really high, and I think that people need to find ways to make sure that they can be in it for the long haul. Well, I would love it if people would check out some of the work that we're doing. So the education initiatives that I'm involved with are Abrome, Abrome.com. I think that if people wanted to go ahead and use that as a model that they would be willing to replicate elsewhere, I think that would be fabulous. We need more self-directed learning spaces for people, not just children, but adults as well. I'm also involved with the Oh Shit What Now Collective, which I've been doing a lot of work with lately. They can be found on Facebook and Twitter. And then Peaceful Streets Project can be found at peacefulstreets.com, facebook.com/Peaceful Streets, Twitter/Peaceful Streets, YouTube/Peaceful Streets. And we're always looking for volunteers who want to get engaged, whether it's through cop watching or know your rights trainings, or even some more hands-on direct action tactics that, not illegal, but less public. Yeah.